I'm going to just turn on the recording for those that would want to follow along. And just as a reminder, because I had to remind myself, right? Our last session was back in July, if I'm not mistaken. So I went back and I rewatched the video, or at least portions of it, to try to get a sense of where we left off. As I have it, we were on page 196, which is towards the end of Second Isaiah, which has only another couple of pages to finish up. So I thought it would be good to finish that. And then just a quick question, because I think Ruth and I think Warren, you've been with us, I think, since the beginning. I know that we read Susanna Heschel's introduction to the book, but did we read Heschel's introduction to the book?
I don't think so. I'm
not sure either. And I think actually in retrospect that was a mistake, because there he sort of formulates the reason why he writes the book. And I think especially what's going to happen once we finish this section, which has really been sort of prophet by prophet, we now sort of take a little bit of a zoom back into theme. So it might be a good idea for us to sort of finish out this chapter and go back to the introduction. Ruth.
Yeah, we did read it. I'm looking because I have marked passages, but you know what? It's never a bad idea to review that, especially after this. You know, we've read several prophets now, and it might, you know, we may have some.
That's actually a really good point.
Or read this in a different way.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Yes, no, I think that's an excellent point. And also as a propelling us forward into the more thematic kinds of chapters that are to come, I think that's a good idea. All right, so we'll do that. And I think, you know, we can read it a little bit quicker since there was an earlier iteration of, but it is important to sort of finish us out with Second Isaiah. And so I think where we got to basically is, and I'll put it up on the screen, although do all three of you have the book?
Is this the one?
Yes, that's the one.
Mine's
it's up to you. We can all read from the book, or so Ron, you could use. Okay, so let me put it up on the screen.
Okay.
Mine's at home.
Not a problem. Not a problem at all. All right, let me just.
I have a different edition.
Oh, okay. You have a different edition. Okay, so all the more so we'll focus on here. So Warren, can you see it? Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, great. So here, if we were going to translate the title of this subsection into Hebrew, what would the Hebrew be? Does anybody know? Okay. So what's the word for light? Let's start with that. Do we know? Or, very good. And do we know what the word is for the nations? And by let's define the nations. Do we know what the nations? So a nation, like the sort of generalized word. Yes, is definitely one of could be a people, but certainly that works. But if we were talking about basically a single word to describe everybody other than the Jews, what would the word?
Goyim.
Goyim. Excellent. Okay, so chances are, right, when we think of the word goy, right, or goyim, it tends to be something of a pejorative, right? Or at the very least, a sort of offhand comment, and can be more so, right, as sort of like, you know, that's for the goyim, right? Like that kind of that may be a very common phrase you heard growing up, right? You know, that kind of stuff.
Basically,
that's for the goyim, right?
That's a racist remark.
Well, so precisely. Okay, so this is the I want to just explain, right, that the pejorative usage of the word is a manipulation of it, right? It's an attempt to basically, after probably, let's be, you know, fair to the people that started to use it that way, right? After generations of being sort of subjugated and cut off from the rest of society, you know, even if you wanted to be a part of, you're told that you're apart from. So what it really is a subversive usage to some degree when it starts out, right? It's to say basically like, you guys think you're the thing and we're excluded from you. It's the other way around, right? We're the Kadosh and you're the Goyim, right? So that piece of it, right, on the one hand, it can feel, at least initially, when we hear it as a pejorative, or as even as Steve said, really to be accurate, right, this sort of racist or bigotous kind of comment. It wasn't necessarily intended to be that way from the outset. And it's part of the reason, like, goyim means really nations. It's really kind of going back to actually our Torah study discussion, I think it was this past week, where we were talking a little bit about sort of the earliest days in the stories of the Torah, right? When we get to Noah and the Tower of Babel and all of those things, right? That we see that all of these quote unquote nations derive from the same place. They just, you know, become something else. They're not part of the covenant that is created with one segment ultimately of Noah's descendants. But, Shem and Ham and Yafet, right, all of them spread out a little bit, and some of them become the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the whateverites, right? And that sort of generalized phrase of the nations is really just meant to say, right, everybody exterior to the Jewish people. But certainly in the original intention, it was not necessarily meant to be something of a superiority complex, right? That we're better than, and then the rest of them are on the outside, right? It's just a sort of distinguishing, delineating mark to say, right, this is the group inside the circle, and this is the group that lives outside of that circle. And the values attached to it, again, that's where the manipulative part comes in. And as I said, I think really, Steve, the way that it sort of developed to become a pejorative was really from that sort of like, the almost knee-jerk response of the oppressed person, right, to flip it back on their oppressors and to make it sort of feel like, we're the paradigm and everybody else is the muck. But here we go back, right? Or legoyim is the phrase, right? So one of the big questions, I think I did a sermon about this actually years ago. I was asked by the grandmother of someone my cousin was marrying, who was Irish Catholic, and she asked me, what is the mission of the Jews? Right? And I was stumped, right? It was a fascinating kind of question, because in Christianity, right, they can usually answer that question pretty clearly. But when you say, what is the mission of the Jewish people? It really caused me to think about it. But one of those missions, according to the Torah, according to God, God's self, and then picked up by the prophets, which will be Heschel's focus now, right, is to be an or legoyim, right? To be a light unto the nations is usually how you hear it. Okay. So let's read a little bit, and then we'll come back to the idea and talk a little bit more about it. Okay, so in contrast to the books of earlier prophets, where the word of God speaks of Israel in the third person, now the voice speaks to Israel directly in the second person. It is not a prophet speaking in his name, as in God's name. It is predominantly God addressing God's self to the people. It is I, not he. Prophetic receptivity is shared by all. Meaning is manifest, insight is common. It is as if the fulfillment of Moses' prayer, quote, would that all Adonai's people were prophets, that Adonai would put God's spirit upon them. Okay, so this is a reference to this very sort of seminal moment in Moshe's prophetic life. And this is if I remember correctly, in the story of Eldad and Medad and this sort of, what's the word I'm looking for again? Ecstatic prophecy taking place elsewhere, right? Moses is basically saying, wouldn't it be great if everybody was the prophet, so it wasn't all on my shoulders, right? He's saying it basically sort of almost sarcastically, okay? But in this case, Heschel is saying, actually, it's almost as if this is the realized reality, right? That everybody becomes a prophet. Israel is declared to be God's spokesman or prophet in chapter 49, verse 2. Just as Adonai says to Jeremiah, quote, I appointed you a prophet to the nations, he says to Israel, quote, I appoint you a light to the nations. The term servant of Adonai used to designate the prophets, and he gives all the examples in the book of Kings in which that becomes the case. In other words, what like the sort of euphemistic, or maybe not euphemistic, really sort of like a title that is used in place of the word prophet or navi is to be used as an Eved Adonai, right? A servant of God. Is now applied not just to the individual, but to all Israel. Quote, as for me, this is my covenant with them, says Adonai, my spirit which is upon you, and my words which I have put in your mouth shall not depart out of your mouth or out of the mouths of your children or out of the mouth of your children's children, says Adonai, from this time forth and forevermore. All your sons shall be taught by Adonai. Let me continue on. And now he's quoting from and this is, again, actually, it's funny. It came up in my Siddur class this morning, right? It's part of one of the blessings that we do, Shefoch Ruchecha Aleinu, to pour out your spirit upon us. It's a literary device, right? Boy, I'm blanking now, Ruth. It's been several weeks, right? Is it metaphor? Is it, I always forget exactly, right? Yeah, a trope, very good, right? Is a common trope that will be sort of caught on by the rabbis, especially as they develop the liturgy. This idea of literally God's spirit pouring down upon us. Sort of in the image I gave this morning is kind of imagining if you've ever stood under a waterfall, right? It's kind of that, or in a rainstorm. Ruth, go ahead.
Well, the common way of greeting in those days was to pour oil on your honored guests. So, in a sense, here it isn't physical, but it's a spiritual. I will pour my spirit, but it's that same idea of pouring. You know, when I visited the old cemetery in Prague, the tombstones of the Levites had pouring vessels on them. You know, the Kohanim had the blessing, and the Levites had pouring vessels. Because they were servants of the Lord.
Correct.
And here this metaphor continues right here. I mean, it's embedded in this. I think in this passage.
It's fantastic. That's really interesting. That is really interesting. Well, so very good. Okay, so let's go back. So, I'll pour my spirit upon your descendants and my blessing on your offspring. I have put my words in your mouth and hid you in the shadow of my hand, to plant heaven, to establish earth, saying to Zion, you are my people. Just as prior to the exile, individual prophets addressed themselves to Israel, here's where it gets interesting, okay? Israel now addresses herself to the nations, okay? So again, what is Heschel basically pointing out is that we start to see a shift at this point in the second Isaiah, beginning really in chapter 49, he quotes mostly from, but really in the 40s in general. Is that basically normally the narrative unfolds, God speaks to the prophet speaks to the people, right? And the role of the prophet is to speak on God's behalf. So here we're getting a shift in which God is speaking directly to the people, and the people are now responding in a prophetic mode, right? Just as prior to the exile, individual prophets addressed themselves to Israel, Israel now addresses herself to the nations. Like Jeremiah, Israel was called to her task from the earliest moment of her existence. Listen to me, O coastlands, hearken, you peoples from afar. Adonai called me from the womb. From the body of my mother, he named my name. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver, he hid me away. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Israel, Heschel says, is more than an instrument in God's design. Israel is made to be, quote, a witness to the peoples. You are my witnesses. Israel is called to be, quote, or legoyim, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. From the accomplishment of his grand design, Adonai waits for the help of mankind. This is the meaning of being God's servant. To be a light to the nations so that God's salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not fail or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching. Okay, so let's just pause for 1 second here, because I think there's something to sort of point out that maybe some of you are already thinking. Does any of this language strike you outside of Judaism as reminding you of anything? Or drawing any kind of connections? Perhaps not, but okay. So here in particular, and this I think came up a few weeks, well, I guess months ago, one of our classes, Christianity really latched on to Isaiah in particular. And you will see Isaiah as one of the most oft quoted of the prophets. Yep. Part of the reason why that's the case is because one can read these texts depending on how you decide to translate, especially because of the usage of a sort of movement between second and third person in which there is no definite identity of, right? But here, if you say, right, behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights, I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will, right, all of this, if you were to simply replace the word he, right, or my chosen with the word Jesus, right, all of this fits into very much the Christian mentality around Jesus as a prophet that was proclaimed by prophecy to become the sort of Messiah. So it's not just this verse, there are several of them which become part of the basis for the way that the early Christianity justifies its position that Jesus was in fact someone who was prophesied to come and ultimately does thus come. But Heschel, as he's pointing out, and this is again the way that our tradition has always read it, is that this is not necessarily referring to certainly anybody in particular, and to a large degree, it's really referring more generally to kind of what our role is, right? To be a light to the nations and to do all of this particular kind of work. Steve, I see your hand.
So does Isaiah, all of this precedes Christianity?
Yes.
And the Christian people retrofitted their ideas onto this.
I wouldn't describe it as retrofitted, because I think what I would describe it as is basically, again, if Christianity and Judaism, especially towards the turn of the millennia, right, you have to sort of look at a paradigm shifting part of history, right? The Romans are basically in control. The Jews are already in sort of different camps to some degree about how much they want to Hellenize and align with and how much they want to reject it. And then you have basically in the stories of the New Testament, right, what is described really as a sort of corruption of the temple and its operations and things like that. And so when early Christianity is beginning, they're not trying to create necessarily a new religion. In its original conception, it was an attempt to sort of, in essence, reform the current religion. So what it's doing is it's looking for, in many cases, sort of going back into sacred text to justify the claim, right? Is sort of the way that I think probably still goes on to this day, right? Somebody stands up and says, I have claimed to this, this knighthood or this particular, thing. You have to go back into documents of history to try to justify where that claim originates. So in Isaiah, especially because there are so many of these prophecies that are nondescript, right? But descript enough to say, look, it did X, Y, or Z, and therefore, right? So it's not to be pejorative again about Christianity or its development. It's simply to explain that basically, Christianity could have very easily just started a new religion, right? Left the Old Testament behind, left all of our writings behind, and started something new, right? Just built a religion around Jesus. But that wasn't the intention. The intention was to say that he was actually the correct continuation, and basically we kept going in the wrong direction, and therefore, right? And that's where the schism exists historically between, right? It's what's called supersessionism. So, but in any case, Ruth, I see a hand, so jump in.
Yeah, much of Christianity views what they call the Old Testament as a prefiguration. Many of the events are a prefiguration of what happens later.
Right.
For example, you see, they take the Annunciation. That is when the messengers come to Abraham and says, in a year your wife will have a child, and they see that as a prefiguration of the birth of Jesus to Mary, and so on and so forth. So all these incidents, I don't think it's retrofitted so much as, well, they would consider it something else, foreshadowing, prefiguration.
Right, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Right. Good. That's the right, perfect terminology for it. So in any case, just wanted to point that out sort of as an interesting aside, but really going back to Heschel, right? He's just trying to drill down on the idea that according to God's own direction, there are prophets, but we are in essence a nation of prophets, in the sense that we become the representation of God's will on earth. And one of our responsibilities is to stand as this sort of, amorphous concept of Or Lagoyim, right, of to being a light of the nations. So the challenge, of course, becomes, how do we define that and all of that? But that's not really the focus of or at least for right now. But I think it will be interesting when we go back to Heschel's introduction in a minute, once we finish off this chapter, we'll see why some of this really does become relevant to his larger thesis. Okay, so let's continue on. So we'll try to make sure we get through all this text before. So his next subsection, the word of our God will stand forever. The grandeur and presence of God are strikingly apparent. Heaven and earth are radiant with his glory. It is enough to lift up the eyes on high and see who created these. Yet men are blind. Spiritually, they live in a dungeon. Israel's destiny is, as we have seen, to quote, open the eyes that are blind, right? Going back to over here in chapter 42. Yet the tragedy is that the servant himself fails to understand the meaning of his mission. Quote, who is blind but my servant, or deaf as my messenger whom I send? Who is blind as my dedicated one, or blind as the servant of Adonai? He sees many things, but does not observe them. His ears are open, but he does not hear. So again, this is Isaiah's beauty, right? This is the poetry of Isaiah, which in some ways, maybe you've already picked up on this. Heschel's writing style is very much a prophetic writing style. In the same way that you have sort of, here it's listed a lot of times as commas, but could very easily be semicolon, right? He tends to write sentences in this kind of way, right? Sees many things, but does not observe them. Ears are open, but does not hear. He loves to use that, and I'm sure that there is an actual poetic description of that particular literary style, but it is that much of an influence in the man that he even really speaks in those kinds of terms. But certainly the imagery is very powerful. And of course, it's speaking about the nature of the people. Okay, there is a task, there is a calling, there is an expectation and a responsibility, and yet the people are not really living up to those expectations or responsibilities. And the key distinction here is to say, right, he sees many things but does not observe them. His ears are open but does not hear. These are the distinctions that we see a lot of times that the rabbis try to make in the Talmud, in our liturgy, right? The difference between the simplistic version, right, observation, versus really understanding. Okay, right, hearing but not actually listening to what is really going on. Right, that just opening the eyes and the ears is not sufficient. There's a next step, and that's where the disconnect is. Okay, so Heschel continues. There were those who, though walking in the darkness, trusted in the name of Adonai and relied on him, according to chapter 50, verse 10, while others, stubborn of heart, did not respond to the message of redemption proclaimed by the prophet in chapter 46, or even forsook Adonai and forgot Zion, as we learn in chapter 65. An extremely bitter, crushing cry burst out of the prophet. We have all become like one who is unclean. All our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment. We all fade like a leaf. Our iniquities, like the wind, take us away. So again, really beautiful imagery here, but also there is a callback to something. Think about this, right? Our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment. Can we think about what that is really referring to? This is really a deeper cut. If I were to narrow it, sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
Joseph's, perhaps Joseph's.
Very good. I wasn't even thinking that, but that's an excellent answer. Excellent answer. If I were to narrow the field and say, if we were thinking about the book of Leviticus, okay, if we were thinking a little bit deeply about polluted garments, like what can happen to a garment and what we do with it. Does that jump out at anybody?
Well, when somebody dies, also or when there's a mold in a house or whatever they call it.
Right, excellent.
House,
Excellent.
Has a disease.
Right, very good. No, so it's exactly right. It's a reference, a sort of deep reference to the idea of really tzara'at, right? When we get to Tazria and Metzora, those two portions, which they're talking about sort of impurities that can find their way even into the bricks of your home and into your clothing, right? Just like a polluted garment, okay? Our righteous deeds are just like a polluted garment. It's basically saying, it's embedded, right? And it's not so easy to undo, right? It's like a stain, okay? And a stain not so easily removed. Steve, did you have a hand up? Okay, just thinking pensively. Okay. The prophet continues to stress the sharp contrast between the creator and his creations, the eternal and the evanescent, the thoughts of God and the thoughts of man, sublimity of the Lord and the triviality of man, heaven and earth, the reality of God and the nothingness of idols, the everlastingness of God's word and the impermanence of human kindness. All flesh is grass, and all its kindness is like the flower in the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Okay, and that's the subtitle, remember, subsection that we're dealing with right now. So this kind of imagery, just as again as an aside, finds its way into a lot of our liturgy around funerals and around remembrance, right? Like a withered grass, like, you know, all of those things should sound familiar from Yom Kippur, right? It's drawn from Isaiah very much. He stresses the contrast between the wisdom of God's works and the limited worth of human deeds, the eternity of God's love and the temporariness of God's wrath, the marvel of God's presence and the enigma of God's silence. Who are you that you are afraid of man who dies, of the Son of Man who is made like grass, and fear continually all the day because of the fury of the oppressor, when he sets himself to destroy? Truly, thou art a God who hidest thyself, O God of Israel, the Savior. Heaven, the most permanent and sublime part of God's creation, as well as the earth, mankind's dearest shelter, which according to Ecclesiastes endures forever, are considered evanescent when compared with God's salvation. Lift up your eyes to the heaven and look at the earth beneath, for the heaven will vanish like smoke, the earth will wear out like a garment, and they who dwell in it will die like gnats. But my salvation will be forever, and my deliverance will never be ended. The deliverance of Israel and the return to Zion are depicted as an event of both universal and cosmic significance. From distant lands, nations will come to Zion and declare, God is with you only, and there is no other. And we will sing to Adonai a new song. Okay, so all of these again are phrases and themes and tropes, as I think Steve said earlier, that will become a recurrent idea throughout our liturgy, both in the high holidays and even really through regular Shabbat services as well. Heaven and the depths of the earth, mountains and every tree in the forest will break forth into singing, for Adonai has redeemed Jacob. For behold, I create a new heaven and a new earth. Salvation will come, in its time I will hasten it. Those who wait for me shall not be put to shame. Okay, so here, you know, again, is part of the reason why Isaiah becomes really, in essence, the most well-known of all of the prophets, the most quoted, the most often used for Haftarah, the most often used for holidays. And as I said, beyond even within Judaism, right, becomes a hallmark of Christian preaching and teaching as well. Certainly in a different context and with a different intention. But we see, right, both Isaiah's power of eloquence, right, which, you know, again, in a world in which your success or failure is largely going to depend on your ability to move the crowd. So certainly, you know, he's got a mastery of literary technique. We see also a God who is both certainly capable of wrath and destruction, but in which we are constantly reminded of God's original intention, which is for the opposite, right? Which is for love and for growth and for compassion and for all of those kinds of things. And we see quite a fair amount of what we would traditionally call, right? I'm thinking back to Steve and our evening together, right? The question about what is prophecy, right? Is that not a guaranteed foretelling of the future, but a projection of sorts, right? Or as Ruth says, right, you know, a sort of foretaste of things that are to come, but in enough vagueness to not know exactly what that necessarily means. But I think what Heschel is trying to do at the end of this chapter is to remind us that one of the core takeaways from Isaiah's message is not that Isaiah was the prophet and that's all that matters, right? That Isaiah was trying to deliver a message to the people to remind them that they are a nation, again, of holy people with a responsibility to God that they are not upholding, and their responsibility beyond just to God and to Pete's self, but to, right, the entire nations around, to be a responsible leader and to, right, free the captive, open the eyes of the blind, right, clothe the naked, feed the hungry, take care of the, you know, the orphan, the widow, the stranger, which together really refers to, again, anybody in our society who cannot otherwise easily take care of themselves without support. Right, these are the core values of the prophetic voice that Isaiah, par excellence, right, beyond probably any of the other prophets, is so effective at conveying. And yet at the same time, the book is, you know, also heartbreaking because we know, right, the message is not generally heeded. And that should sound sort of familiar for current realities just as well as it did for thousands of years ago. So before we go any further, let's talk a little bit. So Steve, go ahead.
So these are ideals that we want to or should aspire to. And another formulation of a light to the nations is that, maybe clearer, is that the world is broken and we are here to repair it, and we are born broken, and our mission in life is to repair ourselves. And I like that formulation because it's very specific, whereas a light to the nation sounds a lot vague.
Right. Well, yes, I think that's probably true. Although for a physicist, right, we can sort of understand that that light in itself is a remarkable thing, but until it is refracted or reflected or focused or directed in some form or the other, it's amorphous, right? So it has no. And so in some ways, right, if we're going to use, let's keep going down this analogy, right? If we imagined, right, and I've used this before as far as sort of Torah is concerned, right? Imagining that God is a eminent source of light, right? And that is the ultimate source of it, and it is directed outwards. And that source of light hits a prism, right? That prism can be the Torah, can be us, can be the Jewish people as a whole, whatever it might be. And the ability then to take that concentrated light and reflect it out in a myriad of directions, and one would presume, right, to illuminate thereby, to provide that kind of light, that's the sort of imagery of it. But as you point out, Steve, right, not every color is suited for every situation, right? The prism will shatter or spatter and send things out in all ways, but there is something not so direct about the way that we're being instructed. It would have been clearer to say, you are a light to the nations. Subnote: here are the various ways in which to be a light to the nations, right? And do X, Y, and Z, and so forth. And to some degree, you're correct. It's not, it's not as direct as it probably could be in that way. But again, when taken sort of Isaiah combined with, or let's say prophetic sort of ethical moral principles, and combining them with halakha, right, Jewish sort of legal expectation and mitzvah and commandment, when you combine all of that together, that's when you, at least sort of theoretically, have us operating on the best level to be that Or Lagoyim. So obviously, we as and I'll just speak for myself, right, as a progressive Jew, one who has a different relationship to halakha, for example, than my great-grandfather would have had, and about how I live my life and what mitzvot that I follow religiously and which ones I have let go of or have reimagined, right? But I've always looked at it as an interplay between these sort of two elements of ourselves. And what can tend to happen is that we, for one reason or another, can decide we like one version better than the other, and that we start to exist in a world in which one takes dominance over the other as opposed to living in symbiosis. And there, again, not to give away some of my sermon for this evening, right? But if you're following, maybe probably not these days, but following what's going on in Israel, what happened for the women of the wall again, and then what happened actually in Knesset as a result of it. So the idea of what happens when you have really an ultra-Orthodox movement of Judaism, which puts all of its emphasis largely on, right, halakha, on the observance of religious law and doctrine and practice at the exclusion of almost any other consideration, it gets, right, at least in my opinion, gets out of whack. And if we only have this sort of like, well, if I show up and do tikkun olam and that's all I do, therefore I'm doing exactly what God told me because I'm doing, right, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, etc., we're missing the other piece of it as well, right? So the idea is to try to find the sort of balance between them. And again, remember, when Isaiah is writing, there is no halakha. There is no, sort of obvious, immediate structure of the 613 mitzvot. It's whatever the Torah law was of the time. And most of those practices revolved around how you plant things, how you grow things, how you treat other people in basic tort issues, that kind of stuff. Not nearly the level of minutia that gets involved by the rabbis many generations later. But all that's just to come back to Steve's original point, which is, what are we supposed to do with this idea of being an Or Lagoyim? And especially these days, if we started walking around and, telling everybody else, hey, we got the good news, just do it like we do it and everything will be fine. I don't think that's going to be terribly well received. So we have to reconceive of this idea a little bit that appears not so much from a sort of superiority complex, but more from a, we've been around for a really long time. We've learned some things, from up and down the experience. And perhaps we have something to say about how best to go about feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, ensuring justice and equality, right? But the truth is we struggle with it as much as anybody else does. That's part of the beauty, again, of Heschel's writing, is sort of getting us back to that.
So are you saying that a light to the nations is purposely ambiguous and Tikkun Olam isn't?
No, Tikkun Olam is actually wonderfully ambiguous because it really is a manufacture. Tikkun Olam as a concept basically took off in the last, let's say, 20 odd years, maybe 30 if we're giving it a little bit further runway. It's actually sort of an obscure reference in the Talmud that is sort of the progressive movements of Judaism really latched onto as an idea and then began to sort of build it up as a central pillar. It doesn't mean that the idea of repairing the world or being involved in the repair of the world isn't significant. But if, for example, you go back to study where that phrase originally comes from and its context, it's not nearly quite what most people would think, right? But at the same time, I don't know whether it's purposely vague or not. I think sometimes we just, we've been talking about this a lot, that using sort of literary imagery, metaphor, simile, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, go ahead, Ruth. Allegory, right? That these are sort of mechanisms to help people to understand what's expected of them, but in a interesting and provocative kind of way, as opposed to a technical kind of way. The Torah has many technical sections, but most of them are in Leviticus. The vast majority of it really is actually sort of narrative with morals and values sort of spun into the narrative. So it really just sort of depends. But I love the line of thinking, though, Steve, right? Is that, I think in some ways that question that I was asked about what the mission is of the Jewish people, we're still trying to figure it out exactly. Right.
So about superiority, I've quoted this before. It's kind of embarrassing on the face of it that 26% of the Nobel laureates in physics are Jewish.
Right.
It sounds like it's disproportionate to the 0.2% of the world's population that is Jewish, but that's really deceptive, because Nobel laureates in physics are chosen from physicists. And if you think, and there's no statistics, and I've spoken to the world's leading demographers on what percentage of the world or the United States physicists are Jewish. My personal experience over 87 years among all the physicists I know is that about a third or a quarter of them are Jewish. So it's not disproportionate. It sounds embarrassingly disproportionate, but it isn't. And so forget what I just said.
No, I find all these things. Sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
Steve, why do you say embarrassingly disproportionate?
Because on the face of it,
who's embarrassed? I'm not embarrassed. I'm proud.
So you like feeling superior to the
right. So that's the question: is right? How does one crow?
Jews are smart. That's great. I don't find that embarrassing.
The fact of the matter is that's true. Not only Jews have a higher average IQ than the Goyim, but they make more money on average, and those two things are connected.
So what I would say,
but that's embarrassing. That's embarrassing.
Embarrassing. I know you're being
humorous, but especially because
I don't find. But seriously,
no. I understand what you're saying.
Our Rosh Chodesh group had a very interesting session on genetics that Arlene Auerbach hosted, and she had all kinds of charts and everything else.
Wow.
And she pointed out that at the time of the Middle Ages, that most Ashkenazi Jews are actually descended from a very small number of people, maybe 200 people
Right.
are our genetic forebears. And, you know,
Right.
and so it's not a surprise that out of the, you know, this very small group of people, the descendants, you know,
That's
came
such
up
a, I wonder if she would give that
They-
presentation to the whole congregation, actually, now
yes,
that I think about it.
it was excellent. But
Huh.
there are also certain diseases that
Yes,
are
exactly. That's what I was going to
that
say.
are
Tay-Sachs.
endemic to
Tay-Sachs,
descendants
yeah.
of those people.
Yeah.
But there are other traits such as maybe
Right.
high intelligence.
Could be some good stuff to come out of it, you know?
Yeah, and I don't feel embarrassed about that.
I don't-
I feel very proud of it.
This is an overwhelming digression, and I'm going to add fuel to the fire. My personal experience is that Sephardic Jews are smarter than Ashkenazi Jews.
Well, and somebody would say, well, sure, that's because they lived among the, you know, the
Yeah,
Arabs.
right. Much more progressive in terms of education and
Yes, they
a lot earlier on.
Science,
Sure.
science, mathematics.
And
Oh, look,
math,
most-
you know,
Most
math.
of our most significant, I should say most, but a good portion of our most significant rabbis, right, are actually of Sephardi origin, right? So, for example, the Shulchan Aruch, which is without question to this day still considered to be the most, you know, important code of Jewish law, because it's the compendium of what most, you know, traditional people will follow to the letter. But it's written by Yosef Karo, who is a Sephardic rabbi.
Right.
And so the reason why, if you're Ashkenazi, you buy a specific version of the Shulchan Aruch that includes what's called the Mapah, which is written by a rabbi who's a generation later, who is Ashkenazi, who writes what are called glosses. So basically interlineary, every time that they discuss something, and then he'll come in and say, Ashkenazim do it this way, right? And you'll see it in smaller print, but that's basically the way that it works. But absolutely, you know, right? Like all of those guys, especially of the medieval period, the most open places for learning and expansion were happening in the Muslim world, not in the Christian world, right? But Ruth's point is actually, you know, at least increasingly seems to be the case, that a lot of like what we would really refer to as like the Pale of Settlements, Eastern European Ashkenazi, it is really largely derived from people who were leaving Spain and Portugal after the Inquisition and who find their way eventually getting to there, not from some massive movement of Western European Jews to the East. So like people who were living, like Rashi was living in France, or eventually those who were living in England. So they get kicked out periodically and they move around. But Western Europe kind of retains its own identity up until a certain point, and then it becomes kind of subsumed into what we call Ashkenazi Jewry. But genetically speaking, I think, Ruth, you're absolutely correct that there is a distinction, right? That really we're all drawing from a pretty small pool, and who knows? You know, genetics has proven to be quite a powerful thing, to say the least. So I will contact Arlene about that, though, because that really could be a very cool conversation.
Really brilliant, really brilliant.
Right.
She comes with the genetic, and she
I was
makes
just going to say, right? That's
really
the key.
very easy to understand because she has charts and, you know.
Yeah,
So
no, exactly, which is
it was
great.
excellent. It was really an eye opener because I never thought before about, you know, this small genetic pool of people that you know.
Look, we had in school an entire weekend. This was actually Rabbi Pankin's idea, if I remember correctly, to have a whole weekend actually about learning for rabbis and cantors who would be involved in people's weddings and things like that, about you know, Jewish genetic diseases, about all the things that we have to sort of counsel as people are getting married. So, you know, depending on the wedding that I'm doing, right, most of them are, you know, between Jewish people, oftentimes of Ashkenazi descent, that you have to actually really counsel them and say, you know, if you're planning on having children, here is information on, you know, genetic testing that you really must do, because if you are not careful, right, your children could very easily be born with Tay-Sachs or with a few other variations. So, you know, Lou and I had to do this, and you know, because I'm basically, as Ashkenazis, you're going to find like 99.9%, you know, or something like that. And thankfully, you know, I think she was a recessive carrier for one thing that was not an issue on my end, and that was it. But I've worked with couples that found out, in fact, that they do, and at that point, you know, it's always a decision. But in the Orthodox world, you know, many people still don't do that genetic testing, and they, especially in the more insular ultra-Orthodox communities, where there can be a whole lot more of what we would call sort of intermarriage of closer genetic lines. You do see, especially with the number of children who are had, right, 5, 6, 7, 8 children sometimes in a family, every single time, right, you're an increase. If either side is going to be, right, a holder, genetically the risk goes up tremendously. So it's, there's two sides of that equation. But anyway, going back to the original point, really, which is, how does one crow appropriately, right? How does one feel very...
Well, here's another take. Intelligence is a Jewish genetic disease.
Look, you can't give away all the good material, right? We gotta, because I'm thinking, we got some humor stuff we got to get together soon, so you don't want to give away all your good jokes.
I have to tell you that we have bragging rights. It may not be true, but we believe that we, the Rosens, from the Katz-Nelson side of the Rosens, are descended from Rashi. So
right,
Rashi,
no, you told me that, right? And there's like a whole...
It may not be true, but we'd like to think so, and it's another reason for feeling superior.
Why not? Why not believe it, right? Why not? What else you got to... we're still trying to figure out with the Geffens, because there is a prevailing theory that we were actually Portuguese and came over, but there is also a town in Holland that is called Geffen, believe it or not. Oh. So it's possible that we just ended up there before we got to Lithuania, who knows? But it is actually, with two Fs, it really is only one family in the United States. And any other Geffen that you meet that has one F is an Israeli that changed their name. And if you think about it, if you were spelling it in Hebrew, Gimel Fei Nun, it makes much more sense to spell it with one F than it does to spell it with two.
So what does it mean? What is the word Geffen?
So Geffen actually, so when we get to the service and we do Kiddush, Bori Pri HaGafen, Gafen is like a weird thing that happened at some point or another. It really should be pronounced Geffen. And so Geffen is a vine. So Pri HaGeffen is the fruit of the vine, which is a grape. So basically, our family name means a fruit vine. Actually, let's see if I can find it very quickly as a last humorous thing. Yeah. So my brother, when I was ordained, got me this, which I really have very few occasions to use, and I'm not sure if you'll see it clearly, but it's a stamp with what was a created family crest of ours. Which has my great-grandfather's book was called Lev Tuvia. So Lev means a heart. So you see the heart sort of coinciding with the Jewish star, and then in the center of it there is a grapevine, a grape leaf cluster. Nice. And and it's fascinating, right? And like a lot of my family became rabbis in one form or the other. And I only recently, you'll get a kick out of this just for the last 30 seconds. So my dad, they're doing a little bit of renovation in the apartment. And that has caused him, after 30, 40, longer, living in the same apartment, of having to go through files, right? And all these kinds of things. And out of it, he's finding all these incredible little nuggets, one of which is a letter where he apparently applied to HUC as a rabbinical student, which I did not know. And it was like urging him to make sure he gets his paperwork in, which I just thought was absolutely hysterical. And the second of that, which is a real aside, but my grandfather, who became a rabbi eventually, was originally a concert violinist. He wanted to be. And so he went briefly to the Juilliard school. And so my dad found a copy of his report card. And let's just say it is not, report cards in like the 30s were not so friendly, right? It basically says, he's a really nice guy. He means well. He's very intelligent, but his skill set is very low, right? It's like, it just makes very clear he's never going to be the artist that he expects to be. And therefore he becomes a rabbi. And here we are talking to each other. So, you never know, the genius of things. Maybe our genius has some limitations, as it goes. But anyway, all I was just going to say about the question about how, though, we do feel good about something without feeling superior. So there's actually a considerable amount of rabbinic literature that is just about how to behave in those kinds of situations, right? What's an appropriate way to be both proud, right, and confident and assured in who we are and what we're doing, and at the same time humble and not self-aggrandizing and all of that. And it's really excellent work. I mean, Myra's class is the way to go for that. Musar is a wonderful way of developing that tension between the two. But I think Myra taught this once also, right, about the idea of tzimtzum, right, which is that sometimes you also have to pull yourself back to make space for other people to also be uplifted. So to some degree, right, you could look at Or L'Goyim as having to be this like in your face, active, telling people what to do situation. Whereas you could also look at it more as a tzimtzum kind of idea, which is to say like, we're just going to try to, by example, demonstrate what, a life where, when we're doing good things and all that. And so I would say, as a last word, right, our temple is a great example of this, right, is to sort of say, like, what does it mean to be a light to the nations? In our case, right, making a conscious effort to not just have our little temple exist an island in Sag Harbor, right, but to make it part of Sag Harbor, right, to be part of the community, to be engaged in social justice work that is outside of our world, right, those kinds of things, not in a snooty, like, look at us doing our thing kind of way, but much more in the sense of, like, this is really what it's about. And, walking over, somebody who's sleeping on the street, is not an acceptable thing for us, and we have to be engaged in it. And I think that's a beautiful part of it.
Beautiful.
So we've come to an end. So the only thing I guess I would say is whether, since you all do, except Warren, you don't have a copy, I can email it to you. If we want to read the introduction over on our own between now and next Wednesday, or we can do it together as a group, whichever you want.
Wednesday, I'll be back in the city. I'll have the book.
Okay. So
okay.
it might be good for us to return to the intro, I think, before we go on and go, because I think actually a lot of what we talked about, especially towards the end of today, will dovetail very nicely into Heschel's kind of overall thesis, which I think is great. And let me just say on a personal note, how great it is to be able to study with you guys again. It's really something I've missed terribly, and God willing, may it continue. That's
so bye.
Okay.
Me too.
Yeah, and Ruth, just let me know again if there's time on Monday. I gave you a couple of the options of time that works for me, and if not, Wednesday or Thursday, I'm pretty wide open during the day, so you can let me know sometimes there. And if it makes sense to do either before or after prophets on Wednesday, we could do that if that's easiest for you.
Thing is, I wanted to include Leah. Excuse us.
Oh yeah, of course, of course.
She has new hours. Her days off now are Monday and Friday. That's that. So if Monday.
Got it. So let's communicate. We can bring Leah in and see about Monday, and if that doesn't work, then Friday is very open for me, so we can work around her.
Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Yes, I'd like to get. I've been anyway. Next.
Yeah. No. I agree with you.
Will be my other daughter, Rabbi Rebecca Joseph, will be our facilitator.
That's great news. Great news.
Total adults, so that should be good.
Oh, that's going to be really good.
Writing little things. I think it'll be very.
That's really good. Oh, I love that. That's really good.